Dear friends, in this video, we are going to discuss the interior of base of skull. Interior of base of skull. Otherwise, we can say cranial cavity. After removing the brain and the meninges, what are the important features you are able to see in the inner aspect of the skull bone? Okay, so let's discuss. I hope you will be knowing the cranial cavity is divided into three parts. Cranial cavity is divided into three parts, namely, this is the anterior cranial fossa. This is the middle cranial fossa, and behind that we have the posterior cranial fossa, right? So cranial cavity is divided into three parts. From anterior to posterior, they are anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, and posterior cranial fossa, right? Okay. Can you tell me how the anterior cranial fossa and the middle cranial fossa both are separated from each other? Anybody? Yes. This is the lesser wing of sphenoid bone. Exactly, it is the posterior border of the lesser wing of sphenoid. Okay. So right now I am marking the lesser wings of sphenoid. Okay. Lesser wings of sphenoid bone, and this is the posterior border of lesser wing of sphenoid bone that forms the boundary between anterior cranial fossa and middle cranial fossa. Okay, posterior border of lesser wing of sphenoid bone. Fine, fine. Now coming to the demarcation between middle and posterior cranial fossa. Okay, so this is the superior border. Okay, superior border of the petrous temporal bone. Superior border of petrous temporal bone. Okay, that forms the boundary or demarcation between middle cranial fossa and posterior cranial fossa. Fine. So I hope you are clear about the three parts of the cranial cavity and how they are separated from each other. Okay. Now, this diagram is showing the various bones forming the cranial cavity. What are the various bones forming the cranial cavity? Okay. So this dotted lines in this diagram indicating the middle cranial fossa, right? Okay. So what are the various bones forming the anterior cranial fossa? Do you know the name of the bone I am marking now? Yes, this is the frontal bone, right? Frontal bone. And this is the ethmoid bone. Fine. Frontal bone, then ethmoid bone. And as we have studied just now, these are the lesser wing of sphenoid bone. Lesser wing of sphenoid bone. Okay. Lesser wing or wings of sphenoid bone. So all these three bones are forming the anterior cranial fossa, right? What about the middle cranial fossa? The middle cranial fossa is formed by, okay, body of sphenoid bone. Okay, so this is the body of sphenoid bone, and on either side of the body of sphenoid bone, you are seeing the greater wings of sphenoid bone. Fine, greater wings of sphenoid bone. Fine, and do you know the name of the bone I am marking now? Yes, this is the temporal bone. Okay, temporal bone. Specifically, the particular part is squamous part of temporal bone. Okay, and this is petrous part of temporal bone. Okay, squamous part of temporal bone and petrous part of temporal bone. They are also forming the middle cranial fossa, right? So the bones forming the middle cranial fossa, mainly the body and the greater wings of sphenoid bone. Okay, body and the greater wings of the sphenoid bone. Then squamous part and the petrous part of temporal bone. Okay, and actually you can see the green color structure, that is the parietal bone actually. Okay, so parietal bone is also forming a small contribution for the middle cranial fossa. Okay, so I hope you are clear how the middle cranial fossa is formed, isn't it? Middle cranial fossa. What are the various bones forming the middle cranial fossa, right? Now coming to the posterior cranial fossa, what are the bones forming the posterior cranial fossa? Yes, the main bone forming the posterior cranial fossa is occipital bone. Okay, occipital bone, which is located behind, isn't it? And also the petrous part of temporal bone. Okay, so petrous part of temporal bone, mainly the posterior surface of the petrous part of temporal bone forms the part of posterior cranial fossa. Fine. Okay. So the petrous part of temporal bone, then occipital bone, then again parietal bone. The green color is parietal bone. Okay. So I hope you are clear about the various bones forming the anterior, middle, and posterior cranial fossa, isn't it? Fine. Let's move to the next slide. So in the upcoming next 3 slides, I am going to talk about the important features of the anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, and posterior cranial fossa. Fine. So in this diagram, okay, you are able to see only the anterior cranial fossa, isn't it? Only we are seeing the anterior cranial fossa, right? So you know this is the frontal bone, this is the frontal bone, and this is the lesser wings of sphenoid bone. Fine. And this is the ethmoid bone. Okay, this green color is ethmoid bone. Okay, so these are the 3 bones forming the anterior cranial fossa: frontal bone, lesser wings of sphenoid bone, and ethmoid bone. Okay, now coming to the important features of the anterior cranial fossa. Any idea about the landmark I am marking now? Exactly located in the midline. It is a part of ethmoid bone, which is a bony projection actually. Bony projection. Yes. Yes, this is the crista galli of ethmoid bone. Okay. This is the crista galli of ethmoid bone. Fine. Then on either side of the crista galli of ethmoid bone, do you see numerous small openings? Numerous small apertures or openings called as, yes, for cribriform plate of ethmoid bone. Okay, cribriform plate of ethmoid bone. On either side of crista galli, you are able to see numerous small apertures called as cribriform plate of ethmoid bone. Okay, you know the importance of cribriform plate of ethmoid bone, right? It allows the passage of olfactory nerves, isn't it? Okay. Then this is the frontal bone, we know. Fine. And this is the lesser wing of sphenoid bone, as we know. Lesser wing of sphenoid bone. Okay. Both these are lesser wing of sphenoid bones. Fine. Now, do you see the projection present in the lesser wing of sphenoid bone? These 2 sharp bony projections present along the posterior border of the lesser wing of sphenoid bone. Any idea about this sharp bony projection present at the posterior border of lesser wing of sphenoid bone? Yes, they are called as anterior clinoid processes. They are called as anterior clinoid processes. Okay. So please remember, anterior clinoid processes are the sharp bony projections belonging to lesser wing of sphenoid bone. Fine. Okay. And remember one more thing here. Okay. So in front of the ethmoid bone, do you see one midline elevation I am marking now? It is called as, it is a part of frontal bone, right? Called as frontal crest. Frontal crest. Crest means elevation. Okay. So just in front of crista galli, we have a projection, okay, or elevation related to the frontal bone called as frontal crest. And do you see a small opening between crista galli of ethmoid bone and frontal crest? Yes, this is the foramen cecum. Foramen cecum. Okay, it is not always present. Okay, but if present, if foramen cecum is present, okay, what is the importance? Yes, it allows the passage of emissary vein. Okay, it allows the passage of emissary vein which connects the nasal mucosa with the superior sagittal sinus. Fine. Yes. Now let's move to the middle cranial fossa. So in this diagram, you are able to see the various bones forming the middle cranial fossa, isn't it? So as we have studied, this is the body of sphenoid bone. Okay, this is the body of sphenoid bone, isn't it? Located exactly in the midline, body of sphenoid bone. Fine. Okay. And on either side of body of sphenoid bone, these are the greater wings of sphenoid bone, greater wings of sphenoid bone, right? Then we have the temporal bone. Okay, temporal bone. I think you will be knowing this is the superior border of petrous temporal bone, which is the demarcation between middle cranial fossa and posterior cranial fossa. Okay, superior border of petrous temporal bone. Okay, fine. Now tell me, what are the important features of the middle cranial fossa? Okay, if you see the body of sphenoid bone, do you see one depression here? Do you see the depression present in the body of sphenoid bone? Yes, it is called as pituitary fossa. It is called as pituitary fossa because it contains the pituitary gland. Okay, so the another name for the pituitary fossa is, yes, hypophyseal fossa. Okay, pituitary fossa, otherwise called as hypophyseal fossa. Fine. And you can see just in front of the pituitary fossa or hypophyseal fossa, there is one elevation actually, okay, called as tuberculum sellae. Tuberculum sellae. Fine. Tuberculum sellae. Just in front of pituitary fossa, we have the tuberculum sellae, and just behind the pituitary fossa, we have one elevation, as you see in this diagram, called as, yes, yeah, dorsum sellae. Dorsum means posterior, isn't it? Dorsum sellae. So tuberculum sellae, pituitary fossa, then dorsum sellae. These three structures, okay, they are collectively called as sella turcica. Sella turcica is the name given for all these three structures together. What are the three structures? Tuberculum sellae, yes, pituitary fossa, otherwise called as hypophyseal fossa, and another one is dorsum sellae. All these three are collectively called as sella turcica. Okay, fine. And please remember, you know this is tuberculum sellae, isn't it? And the lateral ends of the tuberculum sellae, the two areas I am marking now, lateral ends of the tuberculum sellae will be called as, yes, middle clinoid process. Middle clinoid processes. Okay. Middle clinoid processes are nothing but the lateral ends of the tuberculum sellae. Fine. And you know dorsum sellae, isn't it? In this diagram, dorsum sellae, right? And the lateral ends of the dorsum sellae, they are called as, yes, posterior clinoid processes. Posterior clinoid processes. So I hope you are clear about the anterior, middle, and posterior clinoid processes, isn't it? Anterior clinoid processes are projections of the lesser wings of sphenoid bone, right? What about the middle clinoid processes? They are the projections at the lateral ends of the middle clinoid processes, isn't it? Sorry, middle clinoid processes are the projections at the lateral ends of the tuberculum sellae, fine? And this is the dorsum sellae, this elevation. the lateral ends of the dorsum sellae, these two, the lateral ends of the dorsum sellae, they are called as posterior clinoid processes. Fine. Yes. Now, coming to the some other important features present in the middle cranial fossa, can you see the greater wing of sphenoid bone containing some foramen? Okay, the foramen I am marking now is called as, anybody? Yes, it is called as foramen rotundum. Okay, foramen rotundum. Okay, and just behind and lateral. Okay, just behind and lateral to the foramen rotundum, do you see one oval shaped opening? Yes, yes, it is called as foramen ovale. Ovale. Okay, and just behind and lateral to the foramen ovale, we have the foramen, this one. We have the foramen spinosum, isn't it? Foramen spinosum. So remember, foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, and foramen spinosum. All these are present within the greater wing of sphenoid, isn't it? And do you see one opening here? Foramen are opening here, which is present at the junction of body and greater wing of sphenoid. Yes, yes, this opening is called as foramen lacerum. Foramen lacerum. Foramen lacerum. Fine. Okay. Now coming to the some other important features. Okay. You know, this is the anterior surface of petrous temporal bone. Okay. So the anterior surface of the petrous temporal bone contains some important features, like actually here there is one elevation along the anterior surface of the petrous temporal bone. There is one elevation or bulge called as, yes, called as arcuate eminence. Arcuate eminence. Eminence means bulge, otherwise elevation. Okay. So arcuate eminence is produced. Okay, it is produced by, important question, it is produced by superior semicircular canal, which is present in the inner ear. Okay. So arcuate eminence is produced by superior semicircular canal present in the inner ear. Okay. And can you see just in front and lateral to the arcuate eminence, there is a thin plate of bone called as, yes, yeah, tegmen tympani. Okay. So regarding the tegmen tympani, please remember two important points. It is a thin plate of bone. Okay. Tegmen tympani is a thin plate of bone which forms the roof of middle ear cavity. Tegmen tympani forms the roof of middle ear cavity, otherwise called as tympanic cavity. Middle ear cavity, otherwise called as tympanic cavity. Okay, it forms the roof of the middle ear cavity, otherwise tympanic cavity. And see here, this area is called as apex of the petrous temporal bone. Okay, this particular area I have marked here is called as apex of petrous temporal bone, which contains one depression actually, okay, called as trigeminal impression. Okay, so what is trigeminal impression? It is a depression located at the apex of petrous temporal bone. And what is the significance of the trigeminal impression? Yes, the trigeminal impression is the location of, or it contains the trigeminal ganglion. That is the location of trigeminal ganglion. Fine. So please take care of the three important features of the anterior surface of petrous temporal bone. Number one, arcuate eminence. How it is produced, you know. Then number two, tegmen tympani. You know the importance. It forms the roof of middle ear cavity or tympanic cavity. And another one is trigeminal impression. Fine. trigeminal impression is located at the apex of petrous temporal bone. It is the location of trigeminal ganglion. Okay. Now let's talk about the important features of the sphenoid bone. Okay. So take care of this one. This is the sphenoid bone. You know the various parts of the sphenoid bone, isn't it? This green color representing the lesser wings of sphenoid bone. Okay. And this blue color representing the body of sphenoid bone, and this two on either side of the body we have the greater wings of sphenoid bone, isn't it? Fine. And do you see the yellow colored structures here which are directed downwards, okay? So these are called as, yes, exactly, pterygoid processes. These two are called as pterygoid processes. Okay. And both the pterygoid processes of the sphenoid bone will be consisting of medial pterygoid plate and lateral pterygoid plate. Okay. Medial pterygoid plate and lateral pterygoid plate. Okay. And what is the importance of the lateral pterygoid plate? You can see the lateral pterygoid plate will be having two surfaces. One is medial surface, the one I have marked here, medial surface. Another one will be lateral surface of the lateral pterygoid plate, isn't it? So the medial surface and the lateral surface of the lateral pterygoid plate will give origin to the corresponding pterygoid muscles, medial pterygoid and the lateral pterygoid muscles. Fine. And please remember, do you see one opening here at the junction of body of sphenoid and the lesser wing of sphenoid? What is the name of this opening? Anybody? Both sides. At the junction of body and the lesser wings of sphenoid. Yes, it is the optic canal, otherwise called as optic foramen. Exactly. And do you see one opening located at the junction of lesser wing of sphenoid and the greater wing of sphenoid? What is this opening called as? Yes, it is the superior orbital fissure. Superior orbital fissure. Okay, fine. Now, what are these three openings present in the within the greater wing of sphenoid? Exactly, foramen ovale. Just behind and lateral to the foramen ovale, we have the, okay, sorry. I'm really sorry. This is the foramen rotundum. Okay, round shaped, isn't it? So it is called as foramen rotundum. Okay, just behind and lateral to the foramen rotundum, we have one oval shaped opening called as foramen ovale, and just behind and lateral to the foramen ovale, we have one opening called as foramen spinosum. Okay, so ROS, foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, foramen spinosum. All these three foramina are present within the greater wing of sphenoid bone, right? Fine. Now, let's talk about the important features present in the posterior cranial fossa. Fine. Posterior cranial fossa. Okay. Already we know the posterior cranial fossa is mainly contributed by the occipital bone, isn't it? Occipital bone. This blue color is occipital bone. And do you know what is this green color representing? Which bone? Exactly. This is the petrous temporal bone. Petrous part of temporal bone. Which surface of the petrous temporal bone? Exactly. Posterior surface. Posterior surface of petrous temporal bone, right? Okay. Fine. What are the important features of the posterior cranial fossa? You know, this is the largest opening present in the at the base of the skull, which is located in the posterior cranial fossa, namely foramen magnum, isn't it? Yeah. And can you see just in front of foramen magnum, we have one sloping area, sloping surface just in front of foramen magnum. Do you see the sloping surface? This one. This is called as clivus. clivus. Okay, CLIVUS. Clivus is the sloping surface just in front of foramen magnum. Fine. Okay. And on either side of the foramen magnum, do you see two openings? These two. What are these two openings called as on either side of the foramen magnum? Yes, hypoglossal canal. Hypoglossal canal, isn't it? Okay. Now, if you see the posterior surface of the petrous temporal bone, you can see one opening within the posterior surface of the petrous temporal bone, both sides. Any idea about these two openings I have marked? Both sides? Yes, internal acoustic meatus. Fine. Internal acoustic meatus. And just below the petrous temporal bone, or you can say just below the internal acoustic meatus, what is this foramen called as? Jugular foramen. Okay, so jugular foramen is located between the petrous part of temporal bone and the occipital bone, right? Then some other important features are on the inner aspect of occipital bone. Do you see one elevation here on the inner aspect of the occipital bone? What is this elevation called as? Yes, it is called as internal occipital protuberance. Internal occipital protuberance. Okay, fine. And do you see one vertical elevation or crust extending from the internal occipital protuberance? This one towards the foramen magnum. Towards the foramen magnum. Yes, it is the internal occipital crust. Fine. Okay. And on either side of the internal occipital protuberance, do you see the two grooves? These two grooves. Okay. These are the grooves for the transverse sinuses. Okay. These impressions or grooves are produced by transverse sinuses. Transverse sinuses, both sides. These are the grooves for, okay, transverse sinuses. Okay. And you know the transverse sinus will be continuing as what? Sigmoid sinus. Okay. So this is the groove for sigmoid sinus, both sides. Groove for sigmoid sinus. These are the grooves for sigmoid sinus. Fine. And you know the sigmoid sinus will be finally passing through the jugular foramen to continue downwards as internal jugular vein, isn't it? So these are the important features present in the posterior cranial fossa. Fine. Okay, fine. That's the end of the session. Thank you all. Thank you all.